right, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
How's it going? All right, look someone around you and say, I'm glad you're here. All right, we are glad you're here. My voice sound deeper? Makes me sound more manly, doesn't it? Yeah. All right, so we were talking about higher things, and we were talking about how to elevate your mind. And so we're in the sermon that's basically based on the Sermon on the Mount, which is probably Jesus' most famous teaching he ever taught. It's a Sermon on the Mount. Some of the things you saw in that intro movie are things that you probably heard before, right? An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. All those things come from Scripture. We're looking at these things and seeing what Jesus has to say about these things, some of the most famous things he ever said. And the thing about Jesus is that when he explains this to his disciples, he gathers them all up on the side of this mountain, and he starts saying, okay, I told you to follow me, and now you're following me, but here's what I really mean. Here's what this means for you if you're going to follow me. And he starts out with these things like we talked about last week, like saying, the meek shall inherit the earth. And things, and the disciples are listening to all these things going, okay, so this maybe isn't what I thought I signed up for, but here I am, so what am I going to do, right? And so Jesus continues to teach, and as he's teaching, he tends to want to be trying to elevate their minds to a new level. So all throughout this sermon, and the sermon's found in the book of Matthew, Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7 is the Sermon on the Mount, and he kind of, during this whole sermon, says things like this, you've heard it said this, or in church you were brought up this way, and then he says, but I'm telling you this, and he gives them another idea of what that means. So for example, one of the things he says in the sermon is, you've heard it said that you should not murder, but then he kind of elevates it and says, but not only should you not murder, but actually, you shouldn't even be angry with somebody, because being angry with somebody is murder on a different level. It's murder on a thought level, and it's the smaller sin of the larger sin of murder. So Jesus is kind of going, okay, so here's how you were brought up, but I'm going to elevate your mind even further. So we're going to try to elevate our minds during the series. And this is based on a verse that Paul wrote in Colossians. He wrote, set your minds on what?
Things above.
We can do better than that. Set your minds on what?
Things above.
Things above, right? Not on earthly things. And we spend a lot of time with our minds on earthly things, but we're going to try to elevate our minds a little bit. So here's the setting of Christ's message. We read this last week, but this is the setting of where he is talking to his disciples. Now, when he, Jesus, saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. And we talked about last week where one of the church fathers, Jerome, back in the year 300, said this. He said, Jesus specifically went up on a mountain because he was trying to elevate their minds, right? So he's on a mountainside trying to elevate his disciples' minds. Now, if you have your phone with you, you can open the Bible app, and on the Bible app, you can walk through all the scriptures we're going to look at today. So if you want to look back at them and you want to check something we've talked about, that's probably the best place to check them out. So make sure that you do that if you want to walk along with us through these things. There's also Bibles in your pew. I don't know what translation they are, but if you want to grab one of those, you can follow along too. Let's look at Matthew 13. This is what comes right after he brings them up on the mountain. He talks about this. He says, you are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. Now, sometimes, as you read that, maybe you think, here's what I think when I read that. How can salt lose its saltiness, right? Now, I'm no scientist, right? You all know that. You're all very aware of that. I can barely add, right? But I know that salt is some kind of compound, right? And salt cannot break down further than what it is. It is what it is. So how does salt lose its saltiness? And you go, what is Jesus talking about when he says it can lose its saltiness? Well, what theologians and what historians think when Jesus said this was there's several different ways salt was used back in Jesus' time. And one of the places actually they got salt in his time was from the salt sea. And what they would do is they drag minerals out of the salt sea, and then they'd let the water evaporate, and what was left was kind of like salt. But the salt was mixed with impurities, like with little minerals and stuff that shouldn't be in there, and so it wasn't pure salt. So what they would say is sometimes they would use salt as a preservative for food or something, but once the salt dissolved, there would be all this like residue left over. And some people think, well, that's what he was talking about. If the salt is dissolved and is no longer solid anymore, that maybe Jesus is talking about this residue that's left. But in any case, he's telling the disciples that they are the salt of the earth. So here's a couple things we know about salt. The first thing is this. We know that salt adds zest and flavor to food, right? Often you may find yourself, if you're eating at a restaurant or if you're eating at home or whatever, and you taste something and it has no taste, probably the first thing you grab is salt, right? You may grab some other stuff, if your doctor has told you to stay away from salt, maybe you're using Mrs. Dash or something else, right? But a lot of people will just turn to salt because salt instantly adds flavor. It's almost like a miracle, right? Like you put salt on something and all of a sudden you're like, this tastes way better than it did a minute ago, just by adding salt. And you don't have to add a lot of salt. And you also know this, if you put too much salt, it's going to taste terrible, right? It's going to be too salty and it will not bring out the flavor of the food. But salt is really kind of an amazing thing. It adds zest and flavor to food. Most places anywhere in the world that do cooking, salt is one of their main spices that they use, right? Or one of their main ingredients that they use in food. All right, the second thing that salt does, and this is what I mentioned just a minute ago, is it acts as a preservative. So often in older days, right, to preserve food, especially meats and things like that, they would put it into salt. They would pack it in salt, and that would preserve the food. It would last a lot longer, and you could then preserve it for longer than you could if you just had to keep it fresh, right? Because there's not any refrigeration back then. So when he says that you are the salt of the earth, he's talking to the disciples, but we would say, as we read this, as believers in Jesus today, we'd say, well, we are then the salt of the earth. And in effect, you are salt of the earth. So what it means is Jesus is saying something like this. You're supposed to be adding flavor to the people around you. You're supposed to be adding flavor to the life around you. You shouldn't be bland as a person of faith. You should be somebody who is making your life and within the circle of influence that you have better than it is right now. You should be taking your circle of influence in your life as it is bland, and you, as the salt, should be adding zest and flavor to your life and to the world around us. Also, as a preservative, we're supposed to preserve people, right? And if you look at the world around us, there's probably many examples. Just look at the newspaper, right? You can look at the newspaper or the news of the day or of the week, and you can go, man, in a lot of ways, it seems like our world is decaying, right? It's just falling apart. There are parts of the world where we would not want to be right now because it is just so bad. And so part of what we're supposed to do as believers is we're supposed to preserve people from the decay that's happening in our society. Now, Jesus then turns to another metaphor from salt, and he starts talking about light. He says this, you are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden, and neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. Now, in Jesus' time, they lived in very small houses, and so often they didn't make a lot of money. Most of them were poor. But what they would do is they'd take a lamp, an oil lamp, right, and they'd light it, and then they had a lamp stand that was a big, tall stand with a flat platform on it. They'd put it in the middle of the house, which is mostly the house, right? There's usually one big room that everything happened in the house. They would put the lamp on top of that stand, and it would give light to the entire room, right? And it'd light up the house. And Jesus is saying, who would ever put it under a bowl, right? The only reason you'd put the lamp under a bowl is if you wanted to put the light out. So obviously, we're supposed to be giving light to those around us. We need light in this world. Now, it's been interesting, if you look at historically, people would get up in the morning when the sun came out, and they would go to bed when the sun went down. And typically, a lot of bad stuff happened when the sun went down. So darkness was a place you did not want to be in times, right, in older times, because when darkness fell, lots of bad things would happen. And so, but then now with the invention of electricity, now we can have things running 24/7. Things are a lot different. Light actually illuminates tons of things in our world now. And as Jesus is telling his disciples to be the light of the world, he's saying, you need to light up the world. Darkness is a scary thing for a lot of people. When I grew up, I was afraid of the dark. I was afraid of the dark probably until I was 10. And I remember one time when I was actually older than 10, I was in high school, and my parents had gone out for the night, and I was home alone, and there's a noise up in the bedroom, and I was watching TV. And I was like, man, I have to go see what that is, right? So I go upstairs, and I start walking and checking all the rooms. I checked all the rooms except my parents' bedroom. And my parents had one of those pocket doors that you could slide, So I slide the pocket door, and I step inside my parents' room, and there's somebody standing in my parents' room, and I can see their silhouette. It's right in front of the window, and they just froze, and I just froze. I felt like I was frozen for like 45 minutes, honestly, not saying a word, right? I'm just frozen solid, like somebody is in my house. And I don't know who this is. I don't know if they have a gun or a knife. I don't know who it is, but they're not moving, so I'm not moving, right? And we're both just frozen there. Well, after, I don't know how long it was, but finally I got enough guts that I said, I'm just going to lurch over to the light switch and turn on the light switch. And so I lurched over, and I flicked on the light switch, and my parents, for some reason, our house is just weird, right? But my parents had a coat rack in their house. And they had put a coat on it, and they put a hat on top of it. And I swear it was somebody in the room, right? So I stood there staring at a coat rack for 5 minutes, right? But darkness is scary, right? Because you can't tell what's happening in the dark. But once you shine light on something, it reveals a lot, right? Light reveals the truth. Darkness veils the truth. And if you're living in darkness, there's a lot of things that are veiled to you. There's a lot of things you can't see. And if you are a believer in Jesus, you know this, that once Christ came into your life, you saw things differently. You started to see the world differently because God all of a sudden was illuminating your eyes to see things that you hadn't seen before. And you can't describe how that happens or why that happens, but that happens, right? And if you come to know Christ, you say, I see things differently than I used to, especially if you came to Christ at an older age. You say, man, I used to look at the world like this, but now I look at the world like this. Things are completely different. It's like night and day. And so we are supposed to be a light to the world, right? And John, the Apostle John writes this. This is what Jesus said to his disciples. I am the light of the world, and whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And then Jesus turns around and says to his disciples, you are the light of the world. So it's almost like Jesus is passing this on to us, and we're moving forward with that. So why are we supposed to be salt, and why are we supposed to be light? That's a good question, right? Why? What's the purpose of it? The main purpose is this. It's to give God glory. And in the next verse in Matthew writes this, in the same way as salt and light, in the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. So the goal of being salt and light to those around us is so that people will be thankful for you, so thankful for you being in their life that they'll say, man, thank God that so-and-so is in my life. Thank God that this person's in my life. Are there people in your lives that are saying, thank God that you're in my life? And if not, maybe you need to start to ask yourself the question, how do I become more salty to the people around me? How do I spread more light to the people around me so that they will actually give God the glory for me and what I'm doing in their life? That's our job as believers, right? And believers have done this all throughout history. Very famous believers, right? Here's a famous believer you probably heard of, Johann Sebastian Bach. Wrote tons of music that if I played 5 songs right now, you'd go, oh, I know that song, oh, I know that song, oh, I know that song, right? Hundreds of years ago, he wrote this music that's still popular today. And every single one of his masterpieces, he would write this, Sola Deo Gloria, for the glory of God alone. He did it for the glory of God. His life was meant to reflect the glory of God through his music, and he did it. And hundreds of people all throughout the history of the world have given God glory for what they've done. Here's just a few people that you may recognize, right? In the science field, Francis Bacon, believer in Jesus. Blaise Pascal, Isaac Newton, Louis Pasteur. Musicians, Bach, Beethoven, Handel, Brahms, Mendelssohn. Artists, Raphael, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Rembrandt, Van Gogh. Authors, John Milton, Edgar Allan Poe, Washington Irving, Emily Dickinson, William Faulkner, John Updike, J.R.R. Tolkien, and C.S. Lewis. All these people believed in Jesus and dedicated their art to God and to his glory. If you think about how the Christian faith has impacted this world, maybe you don't know this fact. 83% of the hospitals around the world were established by Christians or Christian organizations. 83% of the hospitals in this world. 100 of the first 110 colleges in the U.S. were founded as Christian schools including Yale, Harvard, and Princeton. These people and organizations have been salt and light to our world. So what is God doing today, right? Where is the world the saltiest? I'm going to read for you. This is a blog I read this past week that I thought this really gives a great idea of how the Christian faith is impacting the world around us. So here's what the author Daniel Meyer writes. Christ calls his people to present God's message of hope despite all opposition. Today we face an articulate and assertive army of anti-theists who are deeply embedded in our academic institutions who trumpet their worldview. They declare that if we could just leave religion behind and build instead on the innate genius and goodness of humanity, that we would have a better world. This noble experiment, however, has already been tried. It was conducted with great intentionality in Russia, China, and Korea during the 20th century and led to the starvation and slaughter and suppression of millions of lives. Yet people in those same parts of the world are now flocking to house churches, refurbished cathedrals, corporate offices, and storefront worship centers by the tens of millions, passionately seeking the Christian gospel. After nearly a century of state-sponsored atheism in Russia, 74% of the population now self-identify as Christian. In 1900, Korea had no Protestant church and was ruled impossible to penetrate by mission organizations. Today, there are 7,000 churches in the city of Seoul alone, one of them numbering 750,000 members. Talk about a megachurch, right? Right? Crazy. At the turn of the 19th century, the southern portion of the African continent was only 3% Christian. Today, 63% of the population is Christian, while membership in the churches of Africa is increasing by 34,000 new members every day. Every day, 34,000 people are coming to know Christ. In Hindu India, 14 million of the 140 million members of the untouchable caste system have become Christians. More people in the Islamic world have come to Christ in the last 25 years than in the entire history of missions combined. That's incredible. This is happening in our day and time right now. In our lifetime, this stuff is happening around the world. In Islamic Indonesia, the percentage of Christians is now so high, somewhere around 15%, and the number of megachurches is growing so quickly that the Muslim government will no longer print the statistics. Back in 1950, there were only a handful of evangelical Christians in Brazil. Today, more than 1/5 of its population self-identifies as Protestant. The Catholic Church in Brazil has experienced profound revival, too, going from 50 million adherents in 1950 to more than 134 million today. All the talk these days is of the coming influence of China. David Aikman of the New York Times points out that in China, every year, there are 10 million more converts to Christianity. Even the most conservative estimates suggest that China will soon become the largest Christian country in the world. That's crazy, right? They make all our stuff, and now they're going to be the biggest Christian country in the world. Much is also made of the global expansion of Islam, but Christianity, not Islam, is the fastest spreading faith on earth. By 2050, there will be 3 Christians for every 2 Muslims worldwide. Across the planet, followers of Jesus are increasing by more than 80,000 disciples each day. 510 new congregations of Christian worshipers form every day, which is 3,750 every week. The irony is that, except for the Middle East, where Christianity was born, and Europe and America, to whose civilization gave Christianity birth, Christianity is expanding everywhere. To put it simply, the gospel of Jesus is going out and growing up. Except in Europe and the Middle East and America. Crazy, right? Aren't we the supposed Christian nation, right? I mean, that's what you hear. Yet, Christianity is spreading like a wildfire around the world, but not in America. In the U.S., Christianity's remained flat for about 30 years, but it's growing around the world. So there begs the question, right? How salty are the Christians in America? How much light are U.S. Christians being to those around them? What things have you done lately that people have been grateful for? Who has said, thank God for, put your name in there? Who in your life is thanking God for you? We have the opportunity to point others to God simply through our behavior. If you actually behave in a way that follows the model of Jesus, people should recognize that. And it doesn't take much these days. It is very easy to be different from everybody else. But it's very hard to actually live that out, isn't it? It's a lot easier just to do what everyone else does. We don't think that it's impossible to be Christian in our culture, but it's just going to set us apart. And some of us just don't want to be set apart. We'll just stay bland like everybody else and not add any zest or flavor to the people around us. But let me tell you this, I am so thankful for each of you. So many ways, so many of you have been a blessing in my life. And I would give thanks to God for each person that's in here. Because you've done something in my life that I thank God for. There's probably been multiple times where I've said, thank God for so-and-so, thank God for so-and-so, thank God for so-and-so. I'm so thankful for you guys in my life. Here's the fact. It's not that we're supposed to be the salt of the earth. It's not the fact that we're supposed to be a light to the world. It's that you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Someone put it this way, and I thought it was really great. They said, you might be the only Jesus that some may ever see. So if people around you don't know about Christ, if they've never read the Bible, if they've never been to church, you are the best thing they're going to get that's going to point them to God. You might be the only Bible they may ever read, just by your actions and your behavior. And so the question is this. Here's a couple questions. One is this. Are you being salt and light to those around you? Are you? Are you enhancing the lives of the people around you? Are you sacrificing of your time and your talent and your energy to breathe life into the people that are in your life? Or would they not even recognize it? This is what we're called to do. We are supposed to flavor and give zest and life to the people around us. Here's another question. Who will be giving God praise for you for being in their life this week? You have a chance to change this, right? If you feel like I haven't been that salty, if you feel like I really haven't been spreading my light, I really haven't been shining too bright in the people's lives around me, maybe you need to ask the question, what can I do this week? Just one thing, right? Just do something for somebody else that says, you're important, and I want you to know that I'm going to do something for you, and I'm hoping that you'll give glory to God for it. Not that you're actually going to say that to the person, right? You're just going to do something nice for the person. But by doing that, we are being salt and light to the people around us and the people in our lives. So here's the question. Are you being salt and light? Maybe today you're like, I need to make a change. And that's great. Maybe today you're like, I feel like I'm doing pretty well at that. That's awesome. But wherever you're at, I pray that you try to bring it up one notch, right? Let's influence the world around us. Let's not let the whole rest of the world just go bonkers for God and spread good news all over the earth. Let's have the U.S. be part of that too, right? Let's have it start right here in this sanctuary. And we'll have the sanctuary just, you guys will all filter out into your different jobs throughout the week and your schools or your neighborhoods or wherever you're going. And the goal would be this, that you would go out into this dark world and you would be a light to those around you. And that the people who experience you will say, thank God that you are in their life. Would you pray with me? Father in heaven, we thank you so much for today. Jesus, we thank you for these words that you've said to us. God, we want to be light to those around us. We want to be salt in our circles of influence. So, Father, today we just ask that you would help us to be a positive influence to those around us. Lord, that maybe we'll be like one of these great historical people that we talk about years from now, or maybe we'll be nobody. But, Lord, you will have seen what we did, and we pray that all that we do and that all that we say, Lord, would be set apart from what other people are doing, that people would notice that we are people who live differently, and that they would be drawn to that and say, they have something that I want. I wish I could live my life like that. And maybe they'll come to know you We pray, Lord, that if we can be a part in that story or that person's story, that you would make it so. And we pray this in the powerful name of Jesus. And all God's people said,